welcome to the channel. Today we drift back into one of the darkest chapters in human history, a time when the world stood still. Fear filled the air, and survival was never guaranteed. In this exploration, we uncover why life was brutally unforgiving. During the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920, an invisible catastrophe that reshaped humanity forever. This is not just a story about disease. It is a story about ordinary people facing extraordinary suffering, about families torn apart, and about a world that learned too late how fragile it truly was. If you value deep, immersive history narratives like this one, make sure to like this video, share it with others who love history, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories from the past that still echo into our present. Now take a breath and let us step into the world of 1918. In that year, the world was not standing tall. It was limping forward, wounded, exhausted, and emotionally hollowed out by years of relentless suffering. For 4 brutal years, humanity had been consumed by the greatest war it had ever known. Entire continents had become killing fields. Millions of young men lay buried in foreign soil, their names etched into stone or lost entirely to time. Cities were darkened by grief. Families lived with an empty chair at the table, a uniform folded away, a letter that would never be answered. Again, people believed the nightmare was finally ending. The guns were falling silent. Armistice was in the air. Soldiers were returning home in massive waves, their bodies broken, their minds scarred, but alive. Parades were planned, bells rang. There was talk of peace, of rebuilding, of a future that might finally be free from death. Humanity, battered and bleeding, allowed itself a fragile moment of hope. That moment would not last. The world of 1918 was a perfect storm waiting to ignite. Nations were physically overcrowded and socially fragile. Troop ships, crammed with soldiers, crossed oceans in suffocating conditions. Military camps were packed with men sleeping shoulder to shoulder, coughing in unison, sharing food, air, and disease. Trench warfare had already destroyed basic sanitation. Lice, rats, and filth were a daily reality. Immune systems were weakened by malnutrition, stress, chemical exposure, and constant fear. Civilian life was no better. Cities had swelled beyond capacity due to industrialization and wartime labor demands. Families lived in tight quarters. Tenements were damp, dark, and poorly ventilated. Clean water was not guaranteed. Soap was rationed. Medical care was limited, even in wealthy nations, and nearly non-existent in poor or rural regions. Hospitals were underfunded, understaffed, and already filled with wounded veterans and war casualties. And emotionally, humanity was spent. People were traumatized long before the first fever appeared. Anxiety had become normal. Mourning had become routine. Death had become familiar. When the first reports of a new illness surfaced, many dismissed it as just another hardship in a long list of suffering. The world had already endured so much. What was one more sickness? That complacency would prove fatal. The virus did not arrive with drama or warning. It slipped quietly into existence, carried by human breath, by coughs and whispers, by shared cups and crowded barracks. No one knows for certain where it began. Some believe it emerged in military camps in the United States. Others point to Europe or Asia. but its origin mattered little. What mattered was how easily it moved through. A world designed perfectly for its spread. The war had connected the globe like never before. Railroads carried soldiers and supplies across continents. Ships crossed oceans daily. People were moving constantly from the front to factories, to ports, to hospitals. The virus traveled invisibly along these routes, crossing borders faster than any army ever could. By the time authorities realized something was wrong, it was already everywhere. At first, the illness seemed unremarkably fever, fatigue, a sore throat, symptoms that doctors had seen countless times before. Newspapers referred to it casually, if at all. Wartime censorship discouraged alarming reports. Governments feared panic more than disease. Maintaining morale was considered a national duty. Admitting vulnerability was seen as weakness. So, the truth was softened. Officials reassured the public. Headlines minimized danger. The illness was framed as seasonal, temporary, manageable. Many people continued to gather, to celebrate the end of the war, to embrace returning soldiers unaware that those joyful reunions were accelerating catastrophe behind the optimism. The virus was mutating. The first wave of illness in early 1918 was relatively mild, but it served as a warning. Humanity did not yet understand. It weakened populations. It spread silently and then it returned stronger, faster, and unimaginably lethal. By late 1918, the world realized too late that something had gone terribly wrong. People were collapsing in streets. Soldiers fell ill in camps by the thousands. Entire barracks were emptied in days not by bullets, but by fever. Doctors began noticing something terrifying. Young, healthy adults were dying at alarming rates. This was not how influenza normally behaved. The strongest were falling first. Families watched sons who had survived trench warfare succumb to sickness in their childhood bedrooms. Men who had endured gas attacks and artillery fire now gasped for breath at home. The war had spared them. Peace would not, and still the world struggled to comprehend what it was facing. Medicine, in 1918, was unprepared for a crisis of this scale. Germ theory was accepted, but viruses themselves were poorly understood. Many doctors still debated whether influenza was caused by bacteria, bad air, or environmental factors. There were no microscopes capable of seeing the virus, no tests to detect it, no standardized treatments. Doctors relied on instinct, experience, and hope. The medical system, already strained by war, began to fracture. Hospitals filled beyond capacity. Nurses worked endless shifts, often without protective equipment. Many fell ill themselves. Some died. Others simply vanished from records, their service forgotten. In cities, the atmosphere began to change. The optimism of peace turned into unease. Streets grew quieter. Coughing echoed in public spaces. People started watching one another differently, measuring distance, avoiding contact, sensing danger in every breath. A handshake became suspicious. A sneeze became terrifying. Fear crept in slowly. Then all at once, the Spanish flu did not strike a strong, confident civilization. It struck a world already traumatized, exhausted, and structurally weakened. It exploited overcrowding, censorship, global movement, and medical ignorance. It thrived on denial and deland. Humanity had unknowingly prepared the perfect conditions. for its own suffering. The war had taught people to endure horror, but it had also numbed them. When the flu arrived, many failed to react with urgency because urgency had become a permanent state of existence. There was no emotional energy left to panic properly. Death was already everywhere. This made the pandemic more dangerous, not less. Communities continued to function long after they should have shut down. Factories remained open, parades were held, churches filled with worshippers praying for peace and knowingly inhaling death with every breath. Each gathering became another ignition point, and as the virus spread, it did something far more devastating than killing individuals. It shattered the illusion of progress. The early 20th century was an age of confidence. Electricity lit cities. Machines transformed labor. Science promised solutions to every problem. Humanity believed it was mastering nature. The Spanish flu tore that belief apart. Here was an enemy that ignored borders, armies, and technology. It did not care about wealth, status, or patriotism. It could not be negotiated with or bombed into submission. It moved faster than governments, quieter than propaganda, and deadlier than most weapons of war. By the time people understood the magnitude of the threat, they were already inside it. The world that had survived the Great War was about to face something even more personal. This was not death at a distance, not names printed in newspapers from faraway fronts. This was death in kitchens, bedrooms, and hospital hallways. Death that came without honor, without ceremony, without meaning. The war had killed millions. The pandemic would teach humanity that survival itself was not guaranteed even in peace. And as 1918 drew to a close, the world stood unknowingly at the edge of its greatest medical catastrophe, having mistaken exhaustion for safety and hope for protection. The brutality was only beginning. The illness did not announce itself with spectacle. There were no alarms, no sirens, no sudden realization that the world had crossed a threshold. Instead, it crept in quietly disguised as something familiar. A headache, a sore throat, a mild fever, the kind of sickness people had endured countless times before. In the beginning, many brushed it aside, convinced it was nothing more than a seasonal inconvenience in a world already accustomed to discomfort. That false sense of familiarity was deadly. What made this disease so terrifying was not how it began, but how rapidly it transformed. Within hours, sometimes within a single day, the human body turned against itself. Fevers spiked to unbearable levels. Muscles ached as if poisoned. Exhaustion crushed even the strongest individuals, leaving them unable to stand, speak, or think clearly. What started as discomfort quickly became a fight for survival, and then came the lungs. Victims began to cough, at first dry and irritating, then deep and violent. Each breath became harder than the last. The chest tightened as though wrapped in iron. The body struggled desperately to pull in oxygen, but the lungs, inflamed and flooded, could no longer do their work. People gasped, clawed at their throats, and begged for air that would not come. Doctors were horrified by what they witnessed. Faces turned an unnatural shade of blue, purple, or even black. Fingertips darkened, lips lost all color. This condition, later understood as severe oxygen deprivation, was one of the most chilling signatures of the disease. Patients appeared as if they were being slowly suffocated from the inside. Some died sitting upright. afraid to lie down because breathing became impossible when they did. In many cases, the lungs filled with fluid and blood so rapidly that patients essentially drowned while still conscious. Death was not quiet. It came with panic, confusion, and terror. Some victims thrashed violently as their bodies fought desperately for oxygen. Others slipped into delirium, screaming or hallucinating before collapsing into silence. Families watched helplessly as loved ones faded in front of them in the span of a single afternoon. What stunned physicians most was who the disease chose to kill. Influenza had always been most dangerous to the elderly, the very young, and the already sick. This virus defied that pattern completely. It targeted young adults, people in their 20s and 30s, people in the prime of physical health, soldiers, laborers, mothers, fathers. Those with strong immune systems were often the ones who died fastest. At the time, no one understood why. Today, scientists believe the virus triggered an extreme immune response, causing the body to attack its own tissues in a violent overreaction. But in 1918, this behavior seemed monstrous and inexplicable. Doctors watched healthy men collapse while frail patients survived. The rules of disease no longer applied. Fear deepened as certainty vanished. A man could be laughing in the morning and dead by nightfall. A woman could kiss her children goodbye before bed and never wake up. Entire neighborhoods seemed to fall ill at once as if struck by an invisible curse. There was no predictable timeline, no guarantee of survival, no clear warning signs. People began to understand that this was not an ordinary sickness. The speed of the disease was perhaps its most merciless feature. In many outbreaks, mortality occurred within 24 to 48 hours of the first symptoms. This left little time for intervention even if help was available. In overcrowded cities, ambulances were scarce. Hospitals were already full. Many died at home, untreated and undocumented. Doctors could do little more than watch. Medical knowledge of viruses was painfully limited. Influenza itself was poorly understood, and the concept of viral mutation was still emerging. Many physicians believed bacteria were responsible and attempted to treat patients with antibacterial methods that had no effect. Others prescribed aspirin in massive doses, unknowingly pushing patients into toxicity that worsened breathing and bleeding. Some treatments were rooted in desperation rather than science. Patients were bled to release toxins. Others were given alcohol as a stimulant. Some were exposed to cold air or steam in hopes of easing breathing. None of it stopped the virus. In some cases, these interventions hastened death. Doctors carried a burden they were never trained to bear. They watched as medicine failed repeatedly. They recorded deaths in numbers too large to comprehend. They moved from patient to patient, knowing that there was little they could offer beyond comfort. Many physicians later described this period as the darkest of their career time, when their profession felt powerless and meaningless. Nurses became silent heroes. They worked until collapse, tending to patients, while fully aware that each breath put their own lives at risk. Protective equipment was crude or non-existent. Masks were simple layers of gauze that offered little defense. Many nurses fell ill. Many died. Their sacrifice often went unrecorded, buried beneath statistics. The disease did not simply kill individuals. It overwhelmed systems. Hospitals filled so quickly that hallways, stairwells, and waiting rooms became makeshift wards. Beds ran out, patients lay on floors. Some were turned away entirely. In cities with limited medical infrastructure, care collapsed completely. The sick remained at home, tended by relatives who often became infected themselves. In military camps, the situation was catastrophic. Thousands of soldiers fell ill simultaneously. Barracks became incubators of death. Entire units were incapacitated within days. Some camps reported mortality rates that rivaled the worst battles of the war. Yet the war effort continued. Troops were still moved. Ships still sailed. The virus traveled with them. The psychological toll was immense. People began to live in constant dread of their own bodies. A slight ache became a source of terror. A cough triggered panic. People monitored their temperature obsessively, fearing that a fever meant a death sentence. Sleep became restless. Dreams were filled with suffocation and loss. Parents feared for their children, yet children often survived better than adults. Spouses feared for one another, knowing that a single shared bed could be fatal. Love itself became dangerous. In some communities, panic turned into paralysis. People stopped seeking medical help, believing it was useless. Others flooded hospitals at the first sign of illness, overwhelming facilities even further. Rumors spread rapidly. Some claimed certain foods could prevent infection. Others believed smoking protected the lungs. None of it was true. Death became unpredictable and deeply personal. One household might lose 3 members in a week, while the family next door remained untouched. Survivors carried guilt alongside grief, wondering why they had lived while others had not. There was no logic to the pattern, no comfort in understanding. The disease moved in waves, each one more deadly than the last. The second wave, beginning in late 1918, was especially lethal. It struck with ferocity unmatched in modern history. Cities that had barely noticed the first outbreak were devastated. Cemeteries overflowed. Funeral services were abandoned or rushed. In some areas, the dead were buried without names. The soundscape of daily life changed. Coughing echoed through streets. Ambulance bells rang constantly. Church bells tolled so frequently that some cities ordered them silenced to prevent mass hysteria. Silence itself became oppressive, a reminder that something was terribly wrong. For many, the most brutal aspect was how quickly hope vanished. There was no gradual decline, no time to prepare. Families went to bed expecting recovery and woke to death. Parents sent children to school one day and buried them the next. Communities that had survived war together found themselves undone by a sickness they could not see or fight. The disease stripped away dignity. There were no heroic deaths, no final words. Many died in confusion, delirium, or fear. Bodies were handled quickly, often by strangers. Loved ones were denied the chance to say goodbye. Mourning became rushed, incomplete, unresolved. By the end of each outbreak, survivors were left standing in a world that felt emptied of meaning. They had witnessed the fragility of the human body in its rawest form. They had seen strength turned to weakness in hours. They had learned that health was not protection, youth was not safety, and science was not salvation. The Spanish flu was not just deadly, it was cruel. It killed fast, without mercy, and without explanation. It forced humanity to confront a truth it had long ignored. that despite progress, technology, and belief in control, the body remained vulnerable. Death could arrive without reason or warning, and for those living through it, each sunrise brought not relief, but the terrifying question of whether today would be the day the disease chose them. By the time the true severity of the illness became impossible to deny, the medical world was already collapsing under its weight. Hospitals that had survived years of war casualties were suddenly overwhelmed by something far more chaotic and relentless. This was not an enemy that arrived in organized waves like wounded soldiers from the front. This was unpredictable and merciless. Doctors were trained to fight injury and infection, but they were not prepared for this. In 1918, medicine stood at an uncomfortable crossroads between tradition and modern science. Germ theory had gained acceptance, but viruses were still mysterious. Invisible enemies that could not be cultured, photographed, or directly treated. Many physicians believed influenza was caused by bacteria and searched endlessly for a microbe that fit the symptoms. They were fighting a shadow with the wrong weapons. There were no antiviral drugs, no antibiotics to treat secondary infections like pneumonia, no oxygen tanks capable of sustained delivery, no mechanical ventilators. What modern medicine takes for granted simply did not exist. Doctors had knowledge, dedication, and courage, but almost nothing else. As patients poured in, hospitals transformed into scenes of quiet horror. Beds filled instantly. When beds ran out, mattresses were placed in hallways. When mattresses ran out, patients lay on the floor. Waiting rooms became wards. Storage closets became isolation rooms. The sick arrived faster than they could be examined, diagnosed, or treated. In many cities, hospitals stopped accepting new patients altogether, forcing families to care for the dying at home. Doctors worked until exhaustion blurred their judgment. Many had already been pushed beyond their limits by the war. Some were elderly, others newly trained and inexperienced. They worked endless shifts without rest, often sleeping in chairs or on floors between patients. Meals were skipped. Protective equipment was minimal or non-existent. Masks, when worn, were made of gauze and reused until they were damp and ineffective. Every breath carried risk. Physicians and nurses knew they were exposing themselves to the same disease, killing their patients. Yet they continued working. Many fell ill. Some returned to work while sick, fearing that absence would mean more deaths. Others collapsed mid-shift and were carried from wards they would never return to. Entire hospital staffs were decimated in weeks. Nurses became the backbone of the collapsing system. They fed patients, cleaned bodily fluids, soothed delirium, and held hands as people suffocated. They watched young men beg for air. They watched mothers cry for children who could not be saved. They endured death so frequently that grief became mechanical, something acknowledged but never fully processed. Many nurses died anonymously. Their names were rarely recorded, their sacrifices rarely commemorated. In the chaos of the pandemic, even heroism was swallowed by numbers. Doctors tried everything they could think of. Some prescribed aspirin in massive doses, believing it would reduce fever and inflammation. Patients were given amounts that today would be considered toxic. In hindsight, many likely died from aspirin poisoning, which caused internal bleeding and worsened respiratory failure. At the time, It was one of the few tools doctors had. Others turned to older practices. Bloodletting was still used by some physicians, despite its declining reputation. The idea was to remove toxins from the body. Instead, it weakened patients already struggling to breathe. Alcohol was prescribed as a stimulant or sedative. Morphine was used to calm panics, suppressing breathing further. Steam inhalation, fresh air therapy, and herbal remedies were all attempted with mixed or disastrous results. Medicine became an experiment, conducted in real time with human lives as the cost. Doctors kept notes, tracked symptoms, and searched desperately for patterns. Some noticed that patients placed near open windows seemed to fare slightly better, possibly due to reduced viral concentration. Others observed that rest and hydration helped some survive. But there was no consistent cure, no reliable protocol. The virus did not care about theory. It tore through bodies faster than doctors could respond. Many patients deteriorated so rapidly that by the time a physician reached their bedside, there was nothing left to do. Death certificates were signed in batches. Some doctors later admitted they stopped feeling shock, not because they stopped caring, but because caring deeply for every death would have destroyed them. Outside hospitals, the crisis intensified. Ambulance services were overwhelmed. In some cities, horse-drawn wagons replaced ambulances to transport the sick and the dead. Response times stretched from minutes to hours to days. Some victims never received medical attention at all. Families begged for help that could not come. Telephone lines were flooded with calls from desperate relatives. Doctors had to choose who to visit and who to leave untreated. These decisions haunted them for the rest of their lives. Some prioritized children, others focused on those most likely to survive. There was no ethical framework prepared for this scale of suffering. Undertakers faced a nightmare of their own. As death rates soared, funeral homes were inundated. Coffins ran out, embalmers fell ill, hearses became scarce. Bodies accumulated in homes, hospitals, and makeshift morgues. In some cities, ice rinks, warehouses, and schools were converted into storage for the dead. The smell of death became a constant presence. Communities struggled to dispose of bodies quickly enough to prevent further spread of disease. Mass graves were dug. Burials were rushed often, without ceremony or identification. Families were sometimes forbidden from attending funerals. Loved ones vanished into the earth without a final goodbye. Doctors were asked to do more than heal. They became witnesses, counselors, and decision-makers in a world falling apart. They delivered terrible news repeatedly. They comforted families, knowing comfort was inadequate. They watched societal trust erode as people realized that medicine, a symbol of progress, could not save them. The emotional toll on medical workers was profound. Many later described nightmares that lasted decades. Some left medicine entirely. Others carried a quiet guilt, wondering if they could have done more of it, though logic told them the situation had been impossible. Burnout, trauma, and grief were not terms used at the time, but their effects were unmistakable. In rural areas, the situation was even worse. Medical care was scarce. Doctors might cover dozens of miles on horseback or by carriage. Supplies were limited. News traveled slowly. Families often had no guidance beyond folk wisdom and fear. Entire households fell ill at once, leaving no one capable of caring for the sick or burying the dead. Some communities were effectively abandoned. Doctors refused to enter heavily infected areas, fearing for their own lives. Others were simply unable to reach them. People died alone, untreated, and undocumented. Their stories vanished into silence. The pandemic exposed the fragility of healthcare systems worldwide. Even wealthy cities with modern hospitals collapsed. Under the strain, poorer regions fared far worse. Colonial territories, already neglected, suffered enormous losses with little international attention. Indigenous populations were devastated, sometimes losing entire villages. Medicine had limits, and those limits were now undeniable. The belief that science could conquer all threats was shaken to its core. Newspapers that once praised progress now printed columns filled with obituaries. Medical journals published grim statistics instead of breakthroughs. The language of certainty disappeared, replaced by cautious hope and exhausted resignation. Yet, amid the failure, small acts of humanity persisted. Doctors sat with dying patients when families could not. They sang softly to calm the terrified. Medical students volunteered despite knowing they might not survive. These moments did not stop the pandemic, but they preserved dignity in a world losing it rapidly by the height of the crisis. Medicine was no longer about curing disease. It was about managing death. Hospitals became places where people went not to recover, but to be counted among the dying. The purpose of care shifted from saving lives to easing suffering, from intervention to presence. This shift was devastating for a profession built on healing. And when the waves finally began to recede, the medical community emerged, changed forever. They had seen the consequences of unpreparedness. They had felt the cost of ignorance. They had learned through unimaginable loss that progress without humility was dangerous. These lessons would eventually reshape public health, epidemiology, and emergency medicine, but at a terrible price for those who lived through it. The memory never faded. The sounds of labored breathing, the sight of blue lips, the endless procession of bodies, the feeling of standing helpless while death moved freely through the world. The Spanish flu did not just defeat medicine, it humbled it. As the disease tightened its grip, society itself began to unravel in ways that felt both sudden and surreal. Life did not collapse all at once. It fractured slowly, then, all at once, as fear seeped into every routine and every interaction. The familiar rhythms of daily existence, school bells, church services, market days, evening gatherings, were silenced, one by one, until entire cities felt like abandoned shells haunted by anxiety. Public life became dangerous. Authorities, finally recognizing that crowds were fueling the spread, began shutting down places where people gathered. Schools closed their doors indefinitely. Churches, once places of comfort in times of crisis, were ordered to suspend services. Theaters went dark. Dance halls fell silent. Saloons locked their doors. Sporting events were canceled. Even weddings were postponed or conducted hastily. With only a handful of witnesses, if joy itself had become reckless. These closures were not universally accepted. Many people resisted. Faith leaders argued that prayer was essential during a crisis. Business owners feared ruin. Parents struggled to understand how children could be safer at home when illness was already everywhere. To some, the restrictions felt like an overreaction. To others, they came far too late. Confusion reigned in with it. Resentment The streets changed almost overnight. Cities that had once pulsed with noise and movement grew eerily quiet. Foot traffic dwindled. Shops operated on shortened hours or closed entirely. Streetcars ran with empty seats. People avoided eye contact, crossing roads to avoid passing too close to one another. A stranger's cough could clear an entire sidewalk. Fear reshaped behavior. Handshakes disappeared, replaced by awkward nods or nothing at all. Physical closeness, a sign of trust or affection, became a threat. Parents warned children not to touch anyone. Friends stopped visiting friends. Neighbors avoided neighbors. The invisible nature of the disease made everyone a potential danger. Masks became symbols of survival and division. Simple gauze masks appeared everywhere on factory workers, shopkeepers, police officers, and children. Some wore them diligently, believing they offered protection. Others mocked them as useless or unmanly. In certain cities, mask mandates were enforced with fines or arrests. In others, compliance was voluntary and uneven. Arguments erupted in public spaces. Some accused mask wearers of panic and weakness. Others accused non-wearers of selfishness and recklessness. Protests broke out in several cities, with citizens claiming their freedoms were being violated. The idea that public health could override personal liberty was deeply unsettling to many. Spitting, once common in public, became a punishable offense. Public spitters were fined or shamed. Authorities posted signs warning against the practice. Yet enforcement was inconsistent, and habits died hard. The social fabric frayed under the weight of suspicion and isolation. Trust eroded. Communities fragmented. The shared experience of war had once united people. Now, the shared threat of disease divided them. Yet, even in this darkness, resilience flickered. Neighbors left food on porches for the sick. Volunteers delivered medicine. Strangers checked on the elderly. Letters were written, read aloud, and passed hand to hand when visits were forbidden. Humanity clung to connection, even as it feared it. The Spanish flu did not just test Botticet, tested the soul of society. And in the silence that followed, the world was left to ask, what does it mean to survive when so much has been lost? The answer would shape the century to come. Spitting, once common in public spaces, was suddenly criminalized. Health officials recognized saliva as a vector of disease, and laws were enacted banning spitting on sidewalks or in public buildings. People were fined or jailed for violations. Signs appeared warning against it. What had once been a mundane habit became a symbol of danger and moral failure. Daily routines disintegrated. Children stayed home from school for months, at a time when parents struggled to balance care, fear, and survival. Working-class families faced especially devastating consequences. Missing work meant missing food. Many workers had no choice but to continue laboring in factories, mines, and docks. As illness spread among them, the economy faltered visibly. Factories shut down due to lack of healthy workers. Farms went understaffed during harvest seasons. Deliveries slowed. Goods became scarce. Prices rose. In some areas, basic necessities were difficult to obtain. Poverty deepened, and with it, desperation. Fear changed how people interpreted the world. Every sound became suspect. Every ache became a warning. People monitored their bodies obsessively, checking for fever, weakness, or pain. A simple cold could trigger panic. Sleep was restless, interrupted by worry and the distant sound of ambulance bells. Misinformation spread faster than official guidance. With limited scientific understanding and inconsistent communication from authorities, rumors flourished. Some claimed the disease was caused by poisonous gas left over from the war. Others believed it was a biological weapon engineered by enemy nations. Immigrants in marginalized communities were accused of carrying or spreading the illness intentionally. Scapegoating intensified existing prejudices. Foreigners, the poor, and ethnic minorities were often targeted. In some cities, immigrant neighborhoods were quarantined more harshly than others. Distrust between communities grew. The disease did not create division, but it exposed and amplified what was already there. Wartime censorship worsened confusion. Governments, still operating under wartime rules, suppressed alarming news to maintain morale. Newspapers downplayed outbreaks or framed them as under control as hospitals overflowed. People were told not to panic, even as death surrounded. This disconnect eroded trust in institutions and authority. Spain, not bound by such censorship, reported openly as a neutral country during the war. Spanish newspapers freely covered the epidemic, including illness among public figures. Ironically, this transparency led to the disease being unfairly labeled the Spanish flu, reinforcing the misconception that it originated there. The name stuck, and with it, misplaced blame. Social isolation took a heavy psychological toll. Humans are social creatures, and the sudden withdrawal from communal life was deeply damaging. People grieved alone. Celebrations vanished. Comfort was denied. Many described an overwhelming sense of loneliness, as though the world had withdrawn into itself. Funerals became especially painful. Large gatherings were banned, forcing families to bury loved ones quickly, quietly, and often without ceremony. In some places, funerals were limited to a few minutes. In others, they were prohibited entirely. Bodies were buried by officials. Without family present, mourning was truncated, unresolved, and haunting. The dying were often isolated. To prevent spread, many households separated sick members from the rest of the family. In hospitals, visitation was restricted or banned. People died without seeing loved ones, without final words, without touch. This absence of closure left lasting scars on survivors. Religion struggled to adapt. Churches closed, depriving communities of spiritual support. Clergy attempted to reach congregants through letters or outdoor services, but many felt abandoned in their darkest hours. Faith was tested as prayers seemed unanswered and suffering unrelenting. Law enforcement took on new roles. Police were tasked with enforcing health orders, closing businesses, breaking up gatherings, arresting those who violated mask laws or quarantine. This blurred the line between public safety and personal freedom, creating tension and, at times, violence. Quarantines reshaped entire neighborhoods. Homes with sick occupants were sometimes marked or guarded. Supplies were delivered and left outside. Families inside lived under a cloud of fear and stigma. Some neighbors refused to help, terrified of infection. Others risked their lives to bring food or care-defying orders out of compassion. The sense of time itself changed. Days blurred together. Without social events, work routines, or school schedules, people lost structure. Weeks passed in anxious waiting, listening for news, watching the sick, counting the dead. The future felt uncertain and distant. Children experienced the crisis differently. Many did not fully understand what was happening. They sensed fear but lacked context. Some lost parents and were forced to grow up overnight. Others were shielded but confused by the sudden disappearance of normal life. The pandemic left an imprint on an entire generation. For adults, the strain was relentless. They carried responsibility without answers. They were expected to protect families from an invisible threat with inadequate tools and conflicting advice. Many lived in constant fear of bringing death into their own homes. Social trust eroded. People questioned whether authorities were telling the truth. They doubted neighbors. They suspected strangers. The shared sense of community that had been strengthened during wartime began to fracture under the weight of isolation and fear. Yet even amid the breakdown, moments of solidarity emerged. People sang from windows. Volunteers delivered food to the quarantined. Strangers checked on one another from a distance. Acts of kindness flickered in the darkness, reminders that humanity had not vanished entirely, but the dominant emotion remained fear of infection, fear of death, fear of loneliness, fear that the world would never return to what it had been. Society was not just paused, it was strained to its breaking point. The Spanish flu did not merely attack bodies. It dismantled social structures, eroded trust, and forced humanity to confront how fragile its systems truly were. Daily life became a careful negotiation between survival and despair, between caution and necessity, and for millions, this period would be remembered not just as a time of sickness, but as the moment when the world itself seemed to close its doors and hold its breath, waiting to see who would still be standing when it finally exhaled. Inside homes across the world, the pandemic revealed its most devastating face. While hospitals overflowed and streets fell silent, the true brutality of the Spanish flu was often experienced behind closed doors in kitchens, bedrooms, and narrow hallways where entire families confronted loss with no witnesses and no help. This was where the statistics became human, where numbers turned into names, and where survival often felt like an accident rather than a victory. In countless households, the illness arrived one person at a time. A father came home from work exhausted and feverish. A mother complained of chills and a headache. A child began coughing in the night. At first, families tried to manage, as they always had, believing rest and care would be enough. But within days, sometimes within hours, the disease spread from bed to bed, leaving no one untouched. Entire families fell ill simultaneously. When this happened, there was no one left to care for the sick. Parents lay too weak to tend to children. Children were forced to look after parents they could not help. In some homes, everyone was bedridden, at once waiting helplessly for either recovery or death. Food ran out, water went undrunk. Basic needs were ignored as survival became the only concern. In the most tragic cases, there were no survivors. Neighbors eventually noticed silence where life once existed. Curtains remained drawn. No one answered the door. When authorities finally entered, they found entire households, dead parents and children, together frozen in the positions where illness had overcome them. These scenes haunted those who discovered them. For the rest of their lives, children suffered in ways that defied comprehension. Many woke up to find their parents dead or dying. Some tried desperately to revive them, not understanding what had happened. Others wandered streets, alone orphaned, overnight clutching belongings they could not abandon. Orphanages, already strained by the war, filled rapidly. Extended families were often unable or unwilling to take in more children, fearing infection or lacking resources. For those children who survived, the trauma was lifelong. They grew up with memories of sudden loss, of fear and confusion, of becoming adults too early. Many later struggled with trust and grief they had never been allowed to process. The pandemic shaped an entire generation's emotional landscape. Parents endured a different agony. They watched children weaken and fade, powerless to help. Some buried more than one child in a single week. Others faced the unbearable choice of who to care for first when multiple children were ill. These decisions left scars deeper than words could express. Young adults were hit hardest, and their loss reshaped society. This age group, workers, soldiers, parents, formed the backbone of families and economies. When they died in massive numbers, the consequences rippled outward. Children lost providers. Elderly parents lost caregivers. Communities lost leaders, teachers, craftsmen, and laborers. Widows and widowers became common. Many women found themselves suddenly alone, responsible for children with no income or support. Social safety nets were weak or non-existent. Some were forced into poverty. Others remarried quickly out of necessity rather than love. Men who lost wives struggled to care for children while working long hours, often relying on older daughters to take on adult responsibilities. Grief became constant and overwhelming. There was no time to mourn properly. Death came too frequently. Funerals were rushed or forbidden. People buried loved ones in quick successions, sometimes without ceremony, sometimes without being present at all. The rituals that help people process loss were stripped away, leaving grief unresolved and raw. Many survivors described a sense of emotional numbness. They stopped crying because tears no longer changed anything. Death became expected. Each morning brought fear. Each night brought exhaustion. People learned to live in a state of quiet dread, bracing themselves for the next loss. In rural areas, isolation magnified suffering. Families lived far from doctors and hospitals. News arrived slowly. When illness struck, there was often no guidance beyond rumor and tradition. Some communities attempted to isolate completely, closing roads and refusing entry to outsiders. Others had no choice but to continue interacting, spreading disease unintentionally in these areas. Neighbors were both lifelines and threats. Some risked their lives to bring food, water, or care. Others stayed awake, paralyzed by fear. In certain cases, entire communities fractured as trust dissolved. Long-standing bonds were tested down, sometimes broken permanently. Economic hardship deepened emotional pain. With breadwinners gone, families struggled to survive. Farms went untended. Businesses closed. Savings disappeared. Children were pulled out of school to work. Education was sacrificed for survival, altering life trajectories for millions. Cities faced similar devastation. Industrial workers died in staggering numbers. Factories shut down or operated with skeleton crews. Unemployment soared. Charitable organizations were overwhelmed. Soup kitchens and relief Efforts struggled to meet demand, while volunteers themselves fell ill. Mental suffering spread alongside physical disease. Though the term did not exist at the time, what we now call trauma was everywhere. People experienced persistent anxiety, nightmares, depression, and hopelessness. Some turned to alcohol or drugs to cope. Others withdrew entirely from social life even after restrictions lifted. Faith was tested deeply. Some found comfort in religion, believing the pandemic was a test or part of a divine plan. Others lost faith, entirely unable to reconcile mass suffering with belief in justice or mercy. Clergy themselves were not immune, many dying while tending to the sick, leaving communities spiritually adrift. Survivors carried guilt. Why had they lived when others had not? Why had their children survived when neighbors' children died? This guilt followed many for decades, shaping how they viewed happiness and success. Some felt they had no right to joy. Marriage, love, and intimacy were altered. Fear of closeness lingered long after the virus faded. Many associated physical intimacy with danger and loss. Some relationships deepened through shared survival. Others fractured under stress and grief. Communities changed permanently. Certain neighborhoods never fully recovered their populations. Schools reopened with fewer students. Churches held services for congregations that had shrunk dramatically. Empty houses stood as silent reminders of lives erased. The silence after the pandemic was profound. When the waves of illness finally receded, people expected relief. Instead, many felt emptiness. The constant tension that had defined their lives vanished, leaving behind unresolved grief and exhaustion. The world felt quieter, but not peaceful. Memories of loss became private burdens. Unlike war, which produced monuments and public remembrance, the pandemic left little space for collective mourning. People were expected to move on, to rebuild, to return to normal. Their grief was personal, unacknowledged, and often suppressed. Children who grew up during this time carried its imprint into adulthood. They became cautious, self-reliant, and emotionally reserved. Many feared illness intensely. Some developed lifelong anxieties about health and safety. The pandemic shaped their identities in subtle but enduring ways. Families that survived were never the same. Empty chairs remained at tables. Names were spoken less often as time passed, but never forgotten. Anniversaries of death lingered quietly. In memory and marked by public ritual, the Spanish flu did not end when the virus faded. It lived on in the minds of survivors, in altered family structures, in economic hardship, and in the quiet sadness that followed people throughout their lives. It reshaped how communities understood vulnerability, loss, and resilience. More than any statistic, this human cost defined the pandemic. It was not just millions of deaths. It was millions of broken families, millions of altered lives, and millions of stories that history nearly forgot. And for those who endured it, survival was not a triumph to celebrate. Silence and the knowledge that everything familiar could vanish in a matter of days. When the final waves of illness began to fade, there was no single moment of relief, no clear signal that the danger had passed. The Spanish flu did not end with celebration or victory. It receded quietly, unevenly, leaving behind a world so altered that many struggled to recognize it. People emerged cautiously from isolation, stepping into streets that felt unfamiliar, carrying memories they did not yet have the language to describe. Survival did not feel like triumph. For millions, it felt like exhaustion. Bodies were weakened. Minds were dulled by grief and fear. Communities that had once been full of life now felt hollowed out, as though something essential had been removed and could not be replaced. The dead were everywhere, in empty homes, abandoned farms, vacant factory jobs, and in the silences that followed conversations where certain names were no longer spoken. The scale of loss was almost impossible to comprehend. Estimates ranged into the tens of millions worldwide, but numbers failed to capture the reality. Entire villages had vanished. Indigenous populations were devastated, sometimes losing the majority of their people in a matter of weeks. In some regions, there were not enough survivors left to bury the dead properly. Languages, traditions, and family lines ended quietly unnoticed by the wider world. Yet, remarkably, the pandemic left few monuments. Unlike wars which were memorialized in stone and ceremony, the Spanish flu passed without grand remembrance. There were no victory parades to mark its end, no national days of mourning. The world, weary of death, seemed desperate to forget. Governments focused on rebuilding economies and stabilizing societies. Newspapers shifted attention to politics, progress, and the promise of a better future. Silence replaced acknowledgement. Survivors were expected to move on, to rebuild, to resume life as if it had merely been interrupted rather than fundamentally altered. Many complied, outwardly returning to work, reopening schools, restarting businesses. But internally, the wounds remained raw. For those who had lived through it, memory became fragmented. People remembered the sound of coughing in the night, the smell of sickness, the sight of bodies carried away. They remembered fear as a constant companion. But these memories were rarely shared. There was no collective framework for processing what had happened. Trauma was internalized, buried beneath routines and responsibilities. The world changed in subtle but lasting ways. Public health, once an afterthought, became a central concern. Governments began to understand that disease was not merely a medical issue, but a social and political one. The pandemic exposed the cost of unpreparedness, censorship, and inequality. Slowly, painfully, lessons were learned. New systems emerged. Health departments expanded. Disease surveillance improved. Quarantine protocols were studied and formalized. Research into influenza intensified. The idea that governments had a responsibility to protect public health gained traction. These changes would shape responses to future outbreaks, though never perfectly. Medicine, humbled by failure, began to evolve. Doctors who had witnessed the pandemic pushed for better training, better equipment, and better understanding of infectious disease. The field of epidemiology grew. The importance of data, transparency, and rapid response became clearer. While the Spanish flu could not be undone, its legacy influenced decades of medical progress. But progress came at a cost, measured in lives. The emotional toll lingered long after the virus disappeared. Many survivors struggled with chronic health problems caused by the infection. Others suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression, and persistent fear of illness were common, though rarely discussed openly. Communities carried invisible scars. Trust in institutions had been shaken. People remembered how authorities had downplayed danger, how guidance had changed, how help had sometimes arrived too late. This skepticism toward official reassurance would resurface in future crises, shaping public behavior and resistance. Families rebuilt themselves in altered forms. Households adapted to missing members. Children grew up without parents. Parents aged without children. Extended families became smaller, quieter. Stories were passed down selectively, often softened or abbreviated to spare the next generation from the full weight of the past. For many, remembrance was private. Photographs were kept in drawers. Names were spoken in quiet moments. Anniversaries were observed silently. Grief did not disappear. It learned to exist alongside daily life, integrated into identity rather than resolved. The pandemic reshaped cultural attitudes toward health and mortality. People became more cautious, more aware of the fragility of life. The belief that modern society was immune to nature's forces had been shattered. The illusion of control was replaced with humility, though that humility would fade with time. Ironically, the very scale of the tragedy contributed to its forgetting. With so many affected, no single narrative dominated. The dead were everywhere, yet nowhere in particular. There was no clear villain, no enemy to blame definitively. The virus had no face, no motive, no surrender. It simply came, destroyed, and left. History struggled to contain it. Textbooks mentioned it briefly, often as a footnote to the end of World War I. The pandemic was overshadowed by political change, economic shifts, and the desire to focus on recovery rather than remembrance. For decades, the Spanish flu remained one of the deadliest events in human history that few spoke about in depth. Yet its influence persisted quietly. Urban planning improved ventilation. Hospital design changed. Public attitudes evolved. Hand washing, once inconsistent, became more widely accepted as essential. These small changes, born from suffering, saved countless lives in the years that followed. On a deeper level, the pandemic altered humanity's relationship with uncertainty. People who lived through it understood that catastrophe could arrive without warning, that normal life could collapse in weeks, that survival was not guaranteed by strength, wealth, or virtue. This understanding shaped how they approached risk, family, and the future. For some, it fostered resilience. They learned to endure, to adapt, to find meaning in small moments. Communities that survived often developed stronger mutual support systems, recognizing the necessity of cooperation in crisis. For others, it bred caution and fear. Many avoided crowds long after it was safe. Some remained suspicious of physical closeness. Illness became a source of deep anxiety. These responses were not weaknesses, they were adaptations shaped by trauma. The children of the pandemic carried its legacy forward. They grew up hearing fragments of stories, sensing unspoken grief. They inherited caution, resilience, and sometimes fear. The pandemic shaped their values, even if they never fully understood why. As years passed, the memory faded from public consciousness. Those who remembered aged and died. Stories were lost. The world moved forward, confident once again in progress and modernity. The lessons learned became assumptions, and assumptions gradually turned back into complacency. But the truth remained. The Spanish flu had revealed how interconnected humanity truly was, how quickly disease could spread through global systems, how fragile civilization could be under the weight of an invisible threat. It had shown that denial was deadly, that transparency mattered, and that preparedness was not optional. It also revealed something deeper, that even in the face of overwhelming loss, humanity continued. People loved again. Children were born. Cities rebuilt. Life persisted. Human existence. The survivors did not forget, even if history tried to. They carried the memory quietly in habits, in fears, in values. They knew that peace could be deceptive, that safety could vanish, that life was precious precisely because it was fragile. The Spanish flu was not just a medical catastrophe. It was a reckoning, a moment when humanity was forced to confront its vulnerability, its interdependence, and its limitations. It left behind a world forever changed, even if the changes were not always visible. And though the pandemic eventually slipped into the background of history, its shadow never truly disappeared. It waited in memory, in biology, in the lessons learned and forgotten, reminding humanity that survival is never guaranteed, and that the cost of ignoring that truth can be measured in lives, silence, and generations shaped by loss. As we step back from this chapter of history, we are left not with numbers, but with human lives. Millions of stories that unfolded in silence, fear, and unimaginable loss. The Spanish flu did not end with a victory or a lesson neatly learned. It faded, quietly leaving behind a world forever changed and a generation shaped by grief, resilience, and survival. Its victims were not soldiers on a battlefield, but families in their homes, children in their beds, and communities that vanished without ceremony. Remembering this history is not about fear. It is about understanding how fragile life can be, how powerful human connection truly isn't, how essential compassion becomes when the world is at its weakest. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video, share it with others who value forgotten history, and subscribe to the channel for more deep, immersive journeys into humanity's past. Thank you for watching him. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and remember those who came before.